Imagine a silence growing between two people who were once everything to each other, a father and a son, a mother and her daughter. A silence that isn't peace, but a void carved out by poorly chosen words, forgotten gestures, and wounds that never healed. Now ask yourself, what truly separates two souls who share the same blood? It's not just the shouting, but the unheard whispers. Not just the absences, but the presence soaked in judgment. What starts with a "we'll talk later" often ends with, "I don't want to hear from you anymore." 7 sentences. Just 7. Words that, when spoken often and without awareness, slowly erode the bond between parent and child. They're like invisible cracks, creeping across the walls of a seemingly strong home, until one day everything collapses. Have you ever said something in the heat of the moment and later, in the stillness of the night, felt the crushing weight of guilt? Or worse, have you heard something from the one you loved most, and since then, couldn't look them in the eye the same way again? Freud teaches us that repressed affection doesn't die, it transforms into resentment, into silence, into distance. The words we hurl without thinking don't vanish. They lodge deep in the unconscious of those we love, creating ghosts that haunt for years. How many adults today act like wounded children, repeating the pain they once received with phrases like, "You never do anything right," "I'm tired of you," "My life stopped because of you." These words don't teach, they tear apart. What if the only thing standing between you and your child's love are words you didn't even mean to say? What if the only thing keeping you from reconnecting with your parents is the courage to admit that sometimes we hurt while trying to help? The good news is bonds can be rebuilt, but only with awareness, humility, and a willingness to truly listen. Are you ready to face the 7 phrases that, according to psychoanalysis, can destroy the relationship between parent and child forever? And more importantly, are you ready to learn how to heal that damage before time turns regret into silence? Then, take a deep breath. Because what follows isn't just a video, it's a mirror, a descent into the shadows of affection, a journey back to what, perhaps, can still be saved. There is a moment in every family's story that goes unnoticed. It doesn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It arrives silently, like dust settling on forgotten furniture. A parent looks at their grown child and no longer recognizes the gaze looking back. A son, once eager for bedtime stories, now avoids calls. A daughter, once desperate for affection, now withholds even a simple, "How are you?" These fractures don't begin with betrayals. They begin with unmet needs, buried beneath years of silence and misunderstood intentions. Sigmund Freud would call this the return of the repressed. Emotions cast into the unconscious, only to surface years later in cold glances and strained conversations. In the Freudian view, the family is the first battlefield of the psyche. It's there, in the cradle of our earliest experiences, that the ego is born and wounded. The parent-child bond isn't just emotional, it's symbolic. The parent becomes the first other that the child learns to love, fear, and internalize. But what happens when this figure, meant to offer safety, becomes a source of guilt, pressure, or conditional affection? The child adapts. And in this adaptation, parts of the self are amputated to survive. Later in life, these amputations manifest not as rebellion, but as rejection. Not a rejection of the parent's love, but of the unresolved pain attached to it. One of Freud's most profound insights was that every child, to some extent, creates fantasies about their parents, idealizing them, resenting them, needing them, and fearing them all at once. These contradictions fester when never voiced. So when an adult child distances themselves, it often has little to do with recent events and everything to do with emotional scripts written decades earlier. Scripts filled with lines like, "You disappointed me. You never really saw me. I had to become someone else to be loved." These lines are never spoken aloud, but they echo through behavior, avoidance, and emotional disconnection. In this complex dance of affection and repression, the child who walks away is often mistaken for cruel or ungrateful, but Freud would challenge us to look deeper. He would ask, what unconscious wounds are being protected by distance? What internalized parent is the child still arguing with, even in their 30s or 40s? And perhaps most importantly, who taught them that closeness meant pain? These questions unsettle because they unearth something no parent wants to admit, that love, when laced with fear or control, can become traumatic. This block begins not with blame, but with awareness. It invites us to turn inward, to question the assumptions we carry about those who once needed us the most. Freud reminds us that the mind does not forget, it conceals, and what is concealed between parents and children does not disappear. It festers, and unless brought into the light, it shapes futures marked not by connection, but by quiet emotional exile. The tragedy of emotional exile is that it often masquerades as independence. The adult child who no longer visits, who keeps conversations short, who forgets birthdays not out of hatred but out of self-preservation. Freud might call this a defense mechanism, a subconscious wall built to guard the ego from re-experiencing childhood vulnerability. Behind that wall is not coldness, but a deep and often unarticulated pain, the memory of being unseen, unheard, or only conditionally loved. In the unconscious mind, the parent becomes not just a figure of the past, but a symbolic structure that defines the child's relationship with the world and with themselves. Within the Freudian framework, we must understand that our adult behaviors are often haunted by the child we once were. And so when a parent says, "I did everything for you," the child hears, "You were a burden." When a parent says, "I gave you more than I had," the child may recall the times they were emotionally starved despite material provision. These messages aren't received in the rational brain. They are absorbed by the unconscious and stored in the emotional body. No matter how much time has passed, the psyche remembers, and sometimes the only way to cope is to retreat, not out of revenge, but for inner survival. Freud's concept of repetition compulsion explains why children of emotionally unavailable parents often become emotionally unavailable themselves, or worse, recreate the same dynamic in their own families. It is not a matter of willpower, but of unconscious programming. The very thing they ran from they now carry inside. That is why the cycle continues. That is why the wounds of one generation bleed into the next. The rejection of a parent is not always an end. It is often an echo of what began long ago, amplified by years of unresolved conflict, unmet emotional needs, and missed opportunities for repair. In therapy rooms across the world, these dynamics play out with striking similarity. A man in his 40s weeps not because his father died, but because he never heard, "I'm proud of you." A woman distances herself from her aging mother, not because she hates her, but because her inner child still trembles at the memory of being dismissed. These are not anomalies, they are patterns. Freud taught that if we do not make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives and we will call it fate. In this case, estrangement is not fate, it is a symptom. This block is not about blame. It is about revelation. If you're a parent wondering why your child has grown distant, ask not what they've done, but what they've carried. If you're a child struggling to connect, ask not what your parents lacked, but what part of you was never allowed to exist in their presence. These are not easy questions, but in the discomfort of asking, we may find the beginnings of something real, not a return to the past, but a redefinition of what love can become. To navigate this redefinition, we must first understand the language of emotional memory. Freud emphasized that the mind is layered like an archaeological site, each layer representing different stages of our psychological development. And in every layer, parents hold a different meaning. To the infant, the parent is godlike, source of nourishment, protection, and identity. To the child, the parent becomes the first moral compass, the voice of right and wrong. But as adolescence arrives, that voice can turn oppressive, especially when laced with criticism, control, or conditional approval. When those early needs are unmet or distorted, the child adapts by suppressing certain truths. They learn to act instead of feel, to perform rather than express, and eventually the authentic self is buried beneath layers of who they think they must be to be loved. By the time they become adults, the conflict is no longer external. It's internal. They feel guilt for creating distance, but anxiety when closeness returns. They crave validation but distrust its sincerity. This push and pull is not conscious. It is the residue of years spent navigating unsafe emotional terrain. Freud believed that healing begins with acknowledgement, that what we do not express we repeat. So many adult children long for reconciliation, but not at the cost of their psychological safety. They want to return, but not to a house of mirrors where their pain is denied or minimized. They are not rejecting love, they are rejecting the conditions placed upon it. And for many, the most radical form of self-love is the decision to walk away from what once made them feel small, invisible, or ashamed. Parents too carry wounds. Often they mirror the very traumas they unknowingly pass on. The father who cannot express affection may have never received it. The mother who criticizes her daughter's choices may be echoing her own suppressed regrets. Freud would urge us to see these repetitions not as moral failures, but as unconscious enactments. Everyone plays a role in the psychic theater, but rarely are they aware of the script. And so the most healing act may be to stop acting and begin witnessing without judgment the pain beneath the performance. In this block, we step into the terrain of honesty, not the kind that demands confession, but the kind that invites reflection. The question is no longer who is to blame, but who is willing to see. Because in the end, healing isn't found in the rewriting of history, but in the rewriting of the present. Not by changing what happened, but by choosing what comes next. But choosing what comes next requires something many families fear: vulnerability. Freud asserted that the unconscious resists change. It clings to what is familiar even when painful. So when a parent reaches out and says, "Let's talk," or a child admits, "I'm still hurt," the unconscious trembles. It fears loss of control, of certainty, of narrative dominance. And yet it is precisely in these moments of discomfort that healing can emerge. Not through confrontation, but through the soft, persistent labor of presence. Vulnerability is not weakness, it is the gateway to transformation. A father who says, "I didn't know I hurt you, but I want to understand," cracks open a door that may have been closed for decades. A daughter who whispers, "I needed you back then, and you weren't there," speaks not from blame, but from longing. These are not accusations, they are invitations. And the one who listens without defensiveness holds the key to a new kind of connection, one rooted not in control, but in mutual recognition. Freud's concept of transference helps explain why family reconciliation is so emotionally charged. When we speak to our parents, we are rarely speaking only to them. We are speaking to the parts of them we internalized as children, the voice that told us to toughen up, the silence that left us feeling alone. These echoes live within us. So when we reconnect, we are not only healing relationships, we are healing internal wounds that have shaped how we relate to the world. This healing cannot be forced, it cannot be demanded. It must be invited, with openness, with patience, and with the humility to accept that not all stories end in reconciliation. Some wounds require distance, some hearts need time. And yet, even the attempt to understand, to speak gently into the silence, holds power. It disrupts the cycle. It plants the seed of a new legacy, one where love is not earned through obedience or guilt, but offered freely with all its imperfections. This block reminds us that beneath the anger, beneath the silence, beneath the years of absence, there is still a thread that can be traced back to love. Love that was twisted, perhaps, conditional maybe, but love nonetheless. And if that thread can be grasped, even lightly, something new can begin, not as a return, but as a rebirth. The rebirth of a relationship does not happen in grand gestures. It happens in the microscopic details, tones of voice, pauses that allow the other to speak, eyes that do not look away when pain is named. Freud would argue that the unconscious communicates not just through words, but through gestures, omissions, and slips. A father finally admitting, "I didn't know how to love you the way you needed," can mean more than a lifetime of silent provision. A mother asking, "What was your childhood really like for you?" can be more reparative than any birthday gift ever given. These moments are reparative because they offer the child what Freud called recognition. To be seen not as an extension of the parent's desires or failures, but as a separate being with their own psychic reality. And for the parent, such acts require a dismantling of the idealized self-image. They must confront not only what they did, but what they failed to do. That confrontation is not meant to induce shame, but to create room for new forms of intimacy, ones that are no longer filtered through ego or denial. At the heart of all Freudian analysis lies the search for truth, not the factual truth, but the emotional one, the kind that sits beneath the surface and governs our reactions without our awareness. When a parent says, "I don't understand why my child avoids me," the emotional truth might be, "You never created a space where I could show you who I was." And when a child says, "I can't talk to them," what they might mean is, "It still hurts that I was never enough." These truths are heavy, but they are also liberating, because once spoken, they lose their grip. The unconscious no longer needs to act them out through distance or hostility. The energy that was once spent repressing pain can now be redirected toward rebuilding trust, respect, and even a quiet kind of joy. A joy born not of perfection, but of presence. This block is a turning point. It invites us to shift from excavation to construction, from understanding what broke us to exploring what could mend us. Freud did not believe in quick fixes, but he did believe in transformation through insight. And when that insight is paired with empathy, even the most fractured bond can find a path forward, slowly, tenderly, and with the humility that comes from knowing how fragile we all truly are. Fragility, in Freud's philosophy, is not a flaw. It's a condition of being human. Every child is born defenseless, and every parent, no matter how strong, is filled with doubts. The tragedy arises when neither side can admit this vulnerability. The child hides their pain to protect the parent. The parent hides their regrets to protect their pride. And in this mutual silence, the bond thins, weakens, and often breaks. To heal it, one must first rehumanize the other, not as an authority, not as a disappointment, but as someone equally scared, equally flawed. Freud's idea of the family romance, the fantasy that our parents were once perfect and then cruelly fell from grace, still shapes how many adults perceive their childhoods. But the truth is less mythic, more complex. Most parents did what they could with what they had, and most children, even when grown, still carry the hope that one day their parent will say, "I see you." Healing begins when we can hold both truths, that love was present, and that it often came wrapped in pain. In this new phase of the relationship, small changes have enormous significance. A father asking, "Can you help me understand?" instead of giving advice. A mother listening without correcting or comparing. These aren't just behaviors, they're acts of psychic repair. They send a message to the child's unconscious. You matter, your experience matters. And when repeated over time, they build a new emotional reality, layer by layer. But none of this is possible without mourning. Mourning the parent you didn't have, mourning the child you couldn't be, mourning the years lost to misunderstanding. Freud taught that mourning is essential to psychological health, not because it fixes the past, but because it frees us from it. Only by grieving what never was can we fully embrace what could still be. The tears that come with that grief are not a sign of failure. They are the soul's way of making space for something new. This block holds space for sorrow, but also for surrender. Not the kind that gives up, but the kind that gives in, to truth, to tenderness, to the quiet possibility that it's not too late, that even in brokenness there is beauty. And in naming what was once unspeakable, there is power. Power, in the Freudian sense, is not about dominance, it is about integration. It is the ability to hold multiple truths at once. I was hurt, and I want to heal. You failed me, and I still want connection. These are not contradictions. They are acts of maturity. They require a deep ego strength, forged not in pride but in emotional labor. When a child can say, "I'm not trying to punish you, I'm trying to be free," they reclaim their narrative. And when a parent responds, "I'm here, even if I don't understand everything," they open the door to a new chapter. This chapter doesn't erase the past. It rewrites its ending. Instead of cycles of blame, it builds rituals of repair. Maybe it's weekly phone calls, even if awkward. Maybe it's shared silence that no longer feels hostile. Maybe it's the courage to say thank you or I'm sorry without needing anything in return. These moments are not grand resolutions. They are quiet revolutions. And they matter. Freud believed that the family is where neurosis is born, but also where healing begins, not by pretending the past didn't happen, but by reinterpreting it through new experiences. When love is offered without condition, when presence is given without judgment, the unconscious begins to trust. And that trust, once restored, becomes the foundation for a different kind of bond, less dependent, more mutual, less reactive, more reflective. The key is to stay, not in pain, not in perfection, but in process. To keep showing up, even when it's hard. To speak honestly, even when it trembles. To listen deeply, even when you'd rather defend yourself. This is the slow work of healing the parent-child wound. It is not a single moment, it is a practice, a daily choosing of connection over comfort, of truth over illusion. This block is a mirror. It shows us not just who we were, but who we might become. Not by erasing the old story, but by writing ourselves into a new one, where love no longer demands silence, and distance no longer means defeat. And so we arrive at the heart of it all, the longing to be known. Beneath every rupture between parent and child is this universal yearning, not just to be loved, but to be understood. Freud saw this as one of the most powerful drivers of human behavior. The child seeks recognition, the parent seeks redemption. And when both are willing to lay down their defenses even for a moment, something sacred emerges: mutual humanity. Mutual humanity is not agreement. It is not perfect harmony. It is the ability to say, I see your pain, and I still choose to stay. It is the silence shared after a hard conversation. It is the forgiveness that needs no grand apology. It is the acknowledgement that no one gets out of family unscathed, but that some wounds, when exposed to light, can begin to close. In this final stretch, Freud's legacy offers us one last invitation: to love with awareness, to parent with introspection, to relate not from scripts of guilt or duty, but from a conscious place of presence. When we do this, we don't just change our families, we change our inheritance. We interrupt generations of unspoken pain and offer something new to those who come after us, a template of connection that includes truth, freedom, and compassion. The healing of a parent-child relationship does not begin with a fix. It begins with a pause, a breath, a question asked not to argue, but to understand, a touch not to soothe, but to say, I'm still here. This is not a Hollywood reconciliation. It's real, messy, incomplete, but beautiful in its own right, because it is chosen, not out of obligation, but out of hope. This block does not conclude the story. It expands it, because healing, like love, is never a destination. It is a becoming. And in that becoming, every word, every silence, every tear shared has the potential to write a different ending. One where the past is honored, the present is owned, and the future is finally free to unfold. There are stories that end, and there are stories that transform. This one was never about assigning blame or reopening wounds. It was about illuminating the silent spaces between parents and children, those fragile territories shaped not by what was said, but by what was never spoken. Throughout this journey, Freud's voice has echoed in every reflection. What remains unexamined within us will return in the relationships we most wish to protect. And in understanding this, we begin to see not just the pain of others, but the pain we carry and the pain we sometimes cause without knowing. We return then to where it all began, the need to be seen, not as a role, a success, or a disappointment, but as a full human being with contradictions, with longing, with a history that shaped how we love. Freud taught that to know oneself is to confront the layers of our past, and in doing so, to liberate the present. That liberation does not demand perfection, it demands honesty, the courage to say, I didn't get it right, and the grace to respond, but I'm still here. Perhaps the most powerful truth is this: every relationship can be rewritten, not from scratch, but from sincerity. When love is freed from guilt, when closeness is no longer synonymous with sacrifice, then affection becomes something sacred again, not a duty, but a gift. One freely offered, one humbly received. Healing does not erase the fractures of the past, but it fills them with gold. The Japanese call this kintsugi, the art of mending broken pottery with gold, making the repair more beautiful than the original. Families too can shine where they were once broken. So I leave you with a question. What part of your story is still waiting to be rewritten, not in someone else's words, but in your own voice, at your own pace? Perhaps now is the moment to make that call, to start that conversation, to break the silence not with noise but with truth, because sometimes all it takes is a single sentence said with the right heart to shift an entire lifetime of misunderstanding. If this journey touched something within you, if it stirred a memory, a sorrow, or a hope, I invite you to stay with us. Like, comment, and share this message with someone who may be carrying the same silent weight. And subscribe to this channel, not as a passive viewer, but as someone committed to transforming pain into presence and distance into dialogue. You are not alone, and the story is not over.